The grand hall on Vex Prime sparkled with lights from 1,000 different sources, and the air buzzed with excitement from delegates who had traveled across the galaxy for this moment. Admiral Kress stood near the tall windows and watched the celebration below with his forearms crossed behind his back, and his eyes reflected the colorful lights dancing across the crystalline floor. The Galactic Council had finally done it, and after 300 cycles of careful planning and strategic moves, they had cornered humanity into submission, and the stubborn species that refused to bow would finally learn their place in the cosmic order. Thousands of beings from 47 different species filled the massive chamber, and they danced and ate exotic foods and congratulated each other on their brilliant strategy. And the humans had been isolated from all trade routes, and their colonies had been cut off from supplies and resources, and after decades of pressure, the human spirit had finally broken. Kress allowed himself a moment of satisfaction as he watched a group of Ceronian diplomats raising their glasses in triumph. And the plan had worked perfectly, and humanity would soon be divided among the victorious powers, and their territories would be redistributed, and their people would serve as workers across council space. Far away in the dark emptiness between stars, a different scene unfolded in absolute silence. Captain Lisa Grant sat in the command chair of the Terran Defense Force ship called Relentless, and her fingers drummed quietly on the armrest as she watched. Her crew work at their stations, and every screen was dimmed to the lowest possible setting, and the ship ran on minimal power to avoid detection. The Relentless had been hiding in this dark patch of space for 2 months along with 29 other human warships, and they had maintained complete radio silence, and their heat signatures were masked by experimental technology that the Council knew nothing about. Lisa glanced at her tactical officer, and Lieutenant Jake Morrison looked up from his screen with tired eyes, but his voice remained steady and professional. Jake reported that all 30 ships were in position, and the Council defensive grid faced outward, expecting threats from beyond their borders, and they had no idea that enemy vessels sat right inside their most secure system. Lisa felt a thin smile cross her face, and this was humanity's greatest advantage, and every species in the Council had underestimated them and treated them like primitive warmongers who relied on aggression rather than intelligence. The Council had grown comfortable in their dominance, and they had ruled the galaxy for so long that they forgot what it meant to face a real threat. And they assumed their technology was superior, and their intelligence networks were flawless, and their military strategies were unbeatable. They had never bothered to truly understand what made humans dangerous, and they had never considered that desperation could breed innovation and that isolation could create opportunity. Back on Vex Prime, the celebration reached its peak as Supreme. Chancellor Vorath raised one of his crystalline appendages to call for silence, and the massive holographic screens throughout the hall flickered to life and displayed the official documents of human surrender. The crowd cheered and raised their drinks as Vorath began his speech, and his translated voice boomed through the chamber and echoed off the high ceiling. Vorath declared that this day marked the end of chaos, and the human species with their irrational aggression and unpredictable nature had finally been contained, and their remaining population centers had agreed to terms of surrender, and they would be relocated and re-educated and integrated as servants across Council territories. More cheers erupted and drinks flowed freely, and delegates from dozens of worlds celebrated what they believed was the greatest victory in modern galactic history. But what none of them knew was that the human delegation that signed those surrender documents were volunteers and actors who had bought precious time for the real military to prepare. And while the Council celebrated and toasted their victory, the actual human fleet had been moving into position using gravitational slingshots and cold engine drifts that left no trace. Jake looked up from his console again and reported that all ships were ready, and every system was green, and they could begin the operation on Lisa's command. Lisa took a deep breath and thought about her sister back on Earth and her young nephew, who would grow up in a galaxy that would either respect humanity or fear it, and this single moment would define everything that came after. She gave the order and told her crew to send the signal, and Operation Thunderclap was now active. Throughout the star system, 30 human warships began powering up their engines at exactly the same moment, and these were not the vessels that the Council had cataloged and believed destroyed, and these were something entirely new and something that humanity had been building in secret for 15 years. The celebrations on Vex Prime continued for exactly 47 more seconds, and then reality crashed down on the partygoers like a collapsing star. Every sensor in the system suddenly screamed warnings, and alarms blared through military channels, and security officers scrambled to their posts. Lieutenant Zex of the Valtorian Security Force had been watching the celebration feeds instead of monitoring his sensors, and when his console began shrieking, he nearly fell from his chair in shock and confusion. He shouted into the command channel that there were contacts and multiple contacts appearing throughout the system, and his voice carried pure disbelief as he stared at his screens. Admiral Kress abandoned his spot at the observation window and ran toward the nearest command center, and his ceremonial robes flapped behind him as he moved faster than he had in years. He demanded a report and asked what he was looking at on the tactical displays, and his heart pounded in his chest as he burst through the command center doors. The tactical display showed a nightmare, and 30 red icons had appeared throughout the inner system, and all of them broadcast human identification codes, and this was impossible because human ships had been tracked and accounted for, and intelligence confirmed that only a handful of small patrol craft remained operational. The tactical officer stammered that these signatures did not match anything in their database, and each vessel read at 3 times the size of Council heavy cruisers, and the power readings were off the scale. Kress felt cold fear wash through him, and he ordered his people to get him a visual immediately, and he needed to see what they were dealing with. The main screen flickered and suddenly showed something that defied every assumption the Council had made about human capabilities, and the vessel was angular and brutal-looking, and its hull seemed to absorb light itself, and weapon ports lined its flanks in precise rows, and its engine signature suggested power generation that should not be possible for a species at humanity's supposed technology level. On the bridge of the Relentless, Lisa watched her tactical display with quiet satisfaction, and every human ship had emerged from silent running exactly on schedule, and their positions formed a perfect 3-dimensional cage around Vex Prime and its defensive installations. She ordered her communications officer to open a channel on all frequencies, and she wanted every species in the system to hear what came next. The communications officer confirmed the channel was open and broadcasting across all known frequencies. Lisa stood from her chair and smoothed her uniform, and behind her, the bridge crew worked with quiet efficiency, and they had trained for this moment hundreds of times in simulation, and now it was real. She spoke calmly and clearly, and identified herself as Captain Lisa Grant of the Terran Defense Force commanding the First Fleet, and she informed the Council that they were surrounded, and she demanded they power down all weapons and shields immediately, or any hostile action would be considered an act of war. On Vex Prime, the celebration hall had gone completely silent, and the holographic displays that had been showing human surrender documents now showed Lisa's face projected 30 meters tall for everyone to see. Vorath whispered that this was impossible, and they had destroyed the human fleet and monitored their shipyards, but his microphone was still active, and his shocked words broadcast to the entire assembly. Lisa's expression remained unchanged, and she explained calmly that the Council had destroyed the ships humanity wanted them to find, and monitored the facilities humanity wanted them to see. And she asked if they really thought humans would put all their resources where Council spies could count them. The celebration had turned to silence, and in that silence the old galactic order began to crumble, and humanity had arrived uninvited to rewrite the rules, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The first warning came from the Valtorian Long Range. Sensors, and Lieutenant Zex was supposed to be watching the system boundaries, but like most security personnel, he had been watching the celebration feeds instead, and when his console began screaming alerts, he nearly fell from his station. He shouted into the command channel that there were contacts and multiple contacts appearing everywhere, and his voice cracked with panic as he stared at readings that made no sense. Admiral Kress sprinted toward the command center, and his ceremonial robes flew behind him as he ran faster than he had moved in years, and he burst through the doors demanding to know what was happening. The tactical display looked like a nightmare come to life, and 30 red icons had materialized throughout the inner system, and all of them broadcast human identification codes, but this should be impossible because human ships had been tracked and cataloged and destroyed. Intelligence had confirmed that fewer than a dozen human vessels remained operational, and all of them were small patrol craft hiding in their home system, and none of them should be capable of reaching this far into Council space. The tactical officer stammered that these signatures did not match anything in their database, and each vessel was reading at 3 times the displacement of Council heavy cruisers, and the power signatures were beyond anything they had seen before. Kress felt his blood turn cold, and he ordered his crew to get him a visual feed immediately because he needed to see what they were dealing with. The main screen flickered and suddenly showed something that destroyed every tactical assumption the Council had made about human capabilities, and the vessel was angular and brutal, and its hull seemed to drink in light rather than reflect. It and weapon ports lined every surface, and the engine signature suggested power generation that should not be possible. On the bridge of the relentless Lisa Grant watched her tactical display with quiet satisfaction, and every human ship had emerged from silent running exactly on schedule, and their positions formed a perfect cage around Vex Prime and its defensive installations. She ordered her communications officer to open a channel on all frequencies because she wanted every species in the system to hear what came next. The officer confirmed the channel was open and broadcasting. Lisa stood and smoothed her uniform, and behind her the bridge crew worked with practiced efficiency, and they had trained for this moment hundreds of times, and now it was finally real. She spoke calmly and identified herself as Captain Lisa Grant of the Terran Defense Force commanding the First Fleet, and she informed the Council that they were surrounded and demanded they power down all weapons and shields immediately. While Vex Prime, the celebration hall had gone completely silent, and the holographic displays that had shown surrender documents now showed Lisa's face, projected enormous for everyone to see. Chancellor Vorath whispered that this was impossible because they had destroyed the human fleet and monitored their shipyards, but his microphone was still active and his shock broadcast to everyone. Lisa's expression remained calm, and she explained that the Council had destroyed the ships humanity wanted them to find and monitored the facilities humanity wanted them to see. And she asked if they really believed humans would put all resources where Council spies could count them. Lieutenant Commander Kevin Hayes moved to Lisa's side and reported that all fleet elements had secured their objectives, and the Council orbital weapons platforms had been disabled by electronic warfare, and the Council fleet was scattered and could not form any coherent response. Lisa nodded and ordered her crew to maintain position, but not to fire unless fired upon, because she wanted the Council to fully understand what they were looking at. The human vessels were not just large, but advanced beyond anything the Council had expected, and their shields flickered with energy that Council sensors could not properly analyze, and their weapons remained powered but not aimed, like coiled snakes waiting to strike. Admiral Kress reached the command center and started barking orders to organize a defensive response, and he demanded firing solutions on the human ships. But his orders were met with confused silence, and every tactical officer stared at their screens with expressions of complete disbelief. One officer finally spoke and reported that their weapons targeting systems could not lock onto the human vessels because there was some kind of interference they had never encountered, and their intelligence on human weapons capabilities appeared to be completely wrong. The officer continued in a shaking voice that according to their scans each human vessel carried enough firepower to level an entire continent. In the celebration hall, panic began to set in, and delegates scrambled for exits and shouted for their security teams and demanded explanations that nobody could provide. Everything they thought they knew about humanity was wrong, and the species that was supposed to be defeated and broken had somehow built a fleet that could challenge the entire Council. Lisa's voice cut through the chaos again, and she informed them that they had 1 hour to respond to humanity's terms, and the terms were being transmitted now. She spoke clearly and told them to read the demands carefully and understand that humans had not come to negotiate, but to dictate the new reality. The transmission ended, and the holographic displays shifted to show a document, but this was not a surrender, but a list of demands and reparations and territorial concessions that would reshape the entire balance of galactic power. Kevin turned to Lisa and asked quietly if she thought the Council would actually comply with the demands. Lisa watched the tactical display where Council ships were trying and failing to organize any kind of response, and she said they would have to comply because they had no other choice, even if they did not realize it yet. What? the Council did not understand was that 15 years of isolation had not weakened humanity but strengthened it and given them time to innovate and develop and prepare for this exact moment. While the Council celebrated their superiority, humans had been working with the desperation that comes from facing extinction, and that desperation had bred creativity and innovation beyond what the Council thought possible. The hour passed with agonizing slowness, and in the command center, Admiral Kress assembled representatives from every major Council power, and they all argued about how to respond. Ambassador Trell of the Ceronian Collective insisted they could not bow to human demands, because showing weakness would encourage every minor species to challenge Council authority. But Helen Wright, who was one of the few humans on Vex Prime, stood at the Council table with a very different attitude than she had shown in the past 6 months of captivity. She told them flatly that the transmission was not a negotiation but an information package about the new reality of galactic politics. Chancellor Vorath's crystalline form pulsed with angry orange light, and he insisted that one fleet could not change the balance of power in the galaxy because the Council had hundreds of worlds and thousands of ships. Helen smiled without warmth and asked if they really had all those ships available, because their fleets were scattered across the galaxy fighting what they thought were humanity's last strongholds. She explained that 20 more human fleets were moving into position throughout the galaxy, and this was not just 30 ships but 600 ships, and all of them were as advanced as what the Council could see here. The room erupted in shouting and accusations because it could not be true, and where would humans have gotten the resources and materials and time to build such a fleet? Kress said she was bluffing, but his voice lacked any real conviction. Helen activated a holographic display and showed real-time reports from Council forces across the galaxy, and human vessels were appearing in the Tarlon sector and the Orion Reach and the Helios Junction, in every strategic location that mattered. She explained that while the Council celebrated on Vex Prime, humanity had been moving pieces into place across the entire board. On the Relentless, Lisa received confirmation that Phase 2 had begun, and human fleets were revealing themselves at multiple strategic locations, and each one was carefully chosen to cut off vital Council resources or trade routes. Jake reported that they were receiving transmissions from Council vessels, and several captains were requesting permission to stand down because they were not getting coherent orders from their command structure. Lisa ordered him to tell those captains to maintain current positions and power down weapons, and anyone who tried to run or fight would be disabled. She asked about the Council heavy units and was told their first fleet was 12 hours away at best, and the second and third fleets were scattered across frontier zones and could not form any response for at least 2 days. It was exactly as human strategists had planned, and the Council had been so confident that they scattered their forces to mop up what they thought were humanity's final remnants, and now those forces were isolated and surrounded and receiving news that everything they knew was wrong. The celebration had turned to terrified silence, and from that silence a new galaxy was being born. The arguing in the Council Command Center had reached a fever pitch, and species that had been allies for centuries were now blaming each other for intelligence failures and for underestimating the human threat. Admiral Kress watched as the coalition he had helped build began to crack under pressure. It was never designed to handle, and centuries of carefully maintained alliances were fracturing in real time. A tactical officer reported that the Tarlon Confederation had withdrawn their forces from the defensive perimeter, and they were requesting separate negotiations with the humans. Kress shouted that this was desertion, and they did not have authority to break from the coalition, but his words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Another officer reported that the Helian Protectorate was doing the same, and so were the Corvex clans, and more reports were coming in every minute. Ambassador Trell's scales had gone pale, and he asked if anyone could blame them, because they had joined this alliance for a share of human territories, and now they were looking at human warships that could appear anywhere. He asked why anyone would stay in a coalition that had just led them into complete disaster. In a separate chamber, Helen Wright met with representatives of 3 minor species that had been part of the Council coalition, and they had requested this meeting in secret, away from their supposed allies. Delegate Nira of the Kelvin Union let her tentacles writhe with agitation as she spoke, and she said they had been promised protection, and the Council had told them that supporting the embargo would secure them against human aggression. She continued that now they learned humans had the capacity to destroy any of their worlds whenever they wanted. Helen pointed out calmly that despite having 600 warships scattered across the galaxy, humanity had not destroyed anything, and none of them had fired except in self-defense. She explained that humans were not interested in conquest and never had been. Nira asked what humans wanted from them then. Helen answered honestly that humanity just wanted them to stop shooting and they could trade or not trade as they preferred, but they needed to stop letting the Council use them as shields against humanity. She pulled up a holographic display showing trade routes and explained that the Council controlled their access to markets and controlled what technology they could buy and controlled who they could talk to. Helen said that joining humanity would help break those chains, but staying with the Council meant going down with them when the alliance fell apart. Nira looked at her companions and complex gestures passed between them before she asked what guarantees humanity could offer. Helen explained they could offer the same thing being offered to everyone, which was mutual defense pacts and fair trade, agreements and access to human technology appropriate to their development level. She emphasized there would be no territorial demands and no subjugation, but just partnership. On the bridge of the Relentless, Lisa coordinated with other fleet elements and reports flooded in from across the galaxy painting exactly the picture human strategists had hoped for. The Council coalition was collapsing from within. Jake reported that they had received formal diplomatic requests from 11 species asking to open negotiations separate from the Council, and 3 of them were major powers. Lisa told him to send those requests to the diplomatic teams and make sure everyone understood that humanity was willing to talk, but any species continuing hostile actions would be treated as enemies. She opened a private channel to Admiral Patricia Cole, who commanded the Second Fleet, and asked about the situation in the Tarlan sector. Patricia's weathered face appeared on screen and she reported everything was quiet and the Tarlan fleet had backed off as soon as human ships appeared, and their government was sending signals about switching sides completely. She asked how the main operation was going. Lisa explained that Council leadership was scrambling, and reports indicated their command structure was fracturing, with some admirals wanting to fight and others wanting to negotiate, and everyone blaming everyone else for the intelligence failure. Patricia leaned back in her chair and said she had been doing this for 30 years and never thought she would see the day when humanity held this kind of leverage. Lisa said quietly that humanity had earned it, and every person who died when the Council blockaded their colonies had earned it, and every family that went hungry when trade routes were cut had earned it. She said they just had to survive long enough to make the Council pay attention. Back in the Council Command Center, Chancellor Vorath faced a rebellion from within his own government, and several species were demanding immediate acceptance of human terms, while others called for his resignation. The unity that had taken 300 cycles to build was crumbling in hours. Vorath insisted they could not accept these terms, because humans were asking them to dismantle half their defensive posture and open borders they had kept closed for security and acknowledge human sovereignty over territories the Council had administered for centuries. Admiral Kress said tiredly that humans were not asking, and Captain Grant had been very clear about that. He continued that they needed to face reality because they did not have military capability to remove the human ships, and even if they could mass all their fleets, which would take weeks, the casualties would be catastrophic. He asked how many member species would decide they were better off negotiating with humans during that time. Ambassador Trell, who had finally abandoned his aggressive stance, agreed and said he had been reviewing tactical data, and the human ships were not just advanced but operating with coordination the Council had never achieved. He explained their electronic warfare was shutting down Council sensors, and their shielding was beyond current Council technology, and that was just what could be observed. He asked what other capabilities humans might be hiding. Vorath was silent for a long moment before asking how this had happened, and how they had underestimated humanity so completely. Helen Wright, who had been allowed into the command center as a human representative, answered his question. She explained that the Council underestimated humanity because they had been dominant for so long they forgot what facing an existential threat felt like. She said humans had known nothing but existential threats since reaching for the stars, and humans were good at surviving and adapting. Helen continued that when the council decided to eliminate humanity rather than accept them, they gave humans the strongest possible motivation to become something that could not be eliminated. She walked to the central display where human warships still held perfect positions and explained that every species in the galaxy had lived under council rule so long, they forgot how to truly compete. She said humans grew up on a world where survival meant constant competition and being second best meant extinction. Helen explained that the council tried to apply those principles to humanity and discovered what happens when you threaten something that knows how to fight back. Vorath asked quietly, "What happened now?" Lisa's voice came through the speakers because she had been listening to the entire conversation, and she told them they had a choice. She said they could accept human terms and begin building a real equitable galactic community, or they could refuse and humanity would start taking what they needed by force. Lisa explained that either way the old order was finished, and the only question was how much they wanted to lose before accepting that fact. Admiral Kress looked at the tactical display and at the impossible situation humanity had created, and he made his decision. He told the Chancellor he recommended accepting the human terms. Trell seconded the recommendation. Another delegate added their support, and then another, until the chamber filled with voices accepting what had seemed unthinkable just hours before. Vorath's crystalline form pulsed through a rapid spectrum of colors, and none of them were good. But finally he settled into a resigned blue. He said they would prepare a formal response accepting human terms, and he wanted a direct line to Captain Grant, because if they were going to reshape the galaxy, they might as well start talking about how it would work. Helen Wright allowed herself a small smile because it was not victory yet, but it was the end of the beginning. On the Relentless, Lisa watched as the Council defensive fleet began standing down, and their weapons powered off, and their ships took neutral positions. Around her, the bridge crew maintained professional demeanor, but she could feel the relief and pride radiating from every station. Kevin reported that all fleets were confirming stand-down orders from Council forces, and it looked like they had actually succeeded. Lisa cautioned that this was just the first step, and now came the hard part of making sure this peace actually held. But she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction, looking at the view screen, where the celebration hall on Vex Prime stood quiet and dark. They had come expecting to divide humanity's remains, but instead learned a hard lesson about underestimating a species that refused to die. 3 months had passed since the day the Council celebration turned to stunned silence, and the orbital space around Vex Prime looked completely different now. Human vessels still maintained a presence, but they had been joined by ships from 24 species that had broken with the Council to form new alliances with humanity. Lisa Grant stood in what had once been an exclusively Council diplomatic facility, but was now reorganized as neutral ground for ongoing negotiations. She felt tired because the past months had involved more political maneuvering than her entire military career, but as she looked at the gathered representatives, she felt something she had not felt in years. She felt hope. Chancellor Vorath, who had somehow kept his position despite the catastrophic intelligence failure, announced that the vote had been counted. He said the proposal to reform the Galactic Council into the Galactic Assembly had passed with 73% approval. The chamber erupted in a mixture of cheers and complaints, and the hardliners who still opposed giving humanity equal standing made sure everyone knew their displeasure, but they had been outvoted. Helen Wright, now serving as Earth's official ambassador, stood to address the assembly. She said this was a new beginning for everyone, and the old system was built on hierarchy and control, but the new system would be built on mutual respect and shared prosperity. Helen continued that it would not be easy, and there would be disputes and conflicts and setbacks, but at least now they would face them as partners rather than as conquerors and conquered. In a private meeting room adjacent to the main chamber, Lisa met with Admiral Kress, and the Valtorian military leader had become an unlikely ally. He was one of the few Council officials who immediately grasped the new reality and worked to make the transition as smooth as possible. Kress offered the Valtorian equivalent of a respectful bow and said her fleet had performed admirably and the precision of the operation was remarkable. He said in all his years of service, he had never seen a more perfectly executed strategic maneuver. Lisa thanked him but said she hoped they never had to do anything like that again. Kress agreed and settled his bulk into a chair designed for his species and said he had been reviewing the human technical specifications they had been willing to share. He said their jump drive technology alone was decades ahead of what the Council believed possible, and he asked how humanity achieved such breakthroughs. Lisa smiled and said it was necessity because when fighting for survival, you find solutions you never knew existed. She explained that humans could not match the Council in industrial capacity or raw resources, so they had to be smarter and more innovative and more efficient. Kress asked if humanity was really willing to share that technology with the rest of the galaxy. Lisa pulled up a holographic display showing technology transfer proposals and said they would share with allies under appropriate safeguards and development agreements. She explained that humans were not interested in maintaining a monopoly on advancement because they wanted to lift everyone up. Lisa added that they also wanted to make sure the species they helped would not turn around and use human technology against them. Kress studied the display thoughtfully and said the Council would never have done this because they hoarded technology and used it as a tool of control. He asked why humanity was offering to share it. Lisa explained that a galaxy where everyone was strong and prosperous was safer than one where a few species dominated and the rest struggled. She said humans learned that lesson the hard way on Earth, and were not about to repeat those mistakes on a galactic scale. Across the station in a bar established by enterprising human merchants, Lieutenant Jake Morrison shared drinks with officers from 3 different species. They had been enemies just months ago, but now they swapped war stories and compared tactical notes. A Ceronian pilot named Krell said he still could not believe humanity managed to hide that many ships because their intelligence services had eyes on every human shipyard. Jake grinned and said they had eyes on every shipyard they knew about, but humans spent 15 years building facilities in places the Council never thought to look. He explained they built in asteroid belts and on rogue planets and even inside a few gas giants, because when desperate enough, you get creative. Krell asked about the stealth technology and how long humanity had been working on it. Jake said, 20 years give or take, and they started developing it when they realized the Council would never accept them as equals. He explained that most of it was designed as theoretical exercises and they never thought they would actually have to use it. Jake continued that when the blockade started and when they realized the Council was serious about starving them out, all those theoretical systems suddenly became very practical. In the main diplomatic chamber, the session was winding down for the day, and Ambassador Helen Wright gathered her materials. She noted the small victories and the obstacles still to overcome because the road ahead would be long. Trust was not built overnight, and there were still species that viewed humanity with suspicion or outright hostility. But the trajectory had changed and humanity was no longer an isolated species fighting for survival. They were a major power now and respected and feared in equal measure, and more importantly, they were building something new that might actually last. Chancellor Vorath approached Helen as the chamber emptied and asked for a moment of her time. Helen agreed, and Vorath said he wanted to apologize for his role in the policies that nearly led to human extinction. He said he had told himself they were maintaining order and preserving stability, but the truth was they were afraid. Vorath explained they were afraid of change and afraid of competition, and afraid of a species that did not fit into the comfortable hierarchies they had established. Helen studied him for a moment before responding and said she appreciated the apology, but actions mattered more than words. She told him to help build this new system and make sure it did not repeat the mistakes of the old one, because that was how he could make amends. Vorath said he would try, but suspected his time in leadership was limited, because many blamed him for failing to see what humanity was becoming. Helen's tone was not cruel but honest as she said, maybe that was his greatest contribution, which was serving as an example of what happens when leaders get complacent. She told him to use whatever time he had left to make sure the next generation did not repeat his mistakes. On the bridge of the Relentless, now serving as humanity's flagship at Vex Prime, Lisa prepared for her next assignment. The ship would be returning to Earth for the first time in over a year, and there would be celebrations and debriefings, and then the long work of integrating humanity's military into the new galactic security framework. Lieutenant Commander Kevin Hayes approached with a datapad containing final casualty reports from the operation. Lisa took the pad and braced herself, but the numbers were better than she dared hope. 0 combat fatalities and only a handful of injuries during high-stress maneuvers, and some equipment failures that had been managed successfully. They had pulled off the entire operation without firing a shot in anger. Lisa murmured that it was remarkable because they threatened war, but never actually had to fight one. Kevin said that was the power of deterrence because making them think you were willing and able to destroy them sometimes meant never having to prove it. Lisa agreed and said she hoped it stayed that way, but told Kevin to make sure the crew understood this was not over. She explained the galaxy was still full of species that resented them or feared them or wanted to test them, and they had to stay sharp. Kevin understood and said he was looking forward to at least a few weeks where their biggest concern was navigation, rather than preparing for war. Lisa laughed and said she would drink to that, and told him to set course for Earth because it was time to go home. As the Relentless and its escort vessels began their journey back to humanity's home system, the implications of what happened continued to ripple across the galaxy. Trade routes that had been closed for decades reopened, and species that had been client states began asserting independence and technology, began flowing in new directions. And in shipyards throughout human-controlled space, construction continued on the next generation of vessels, not because humanity expected war, but because they learned that peace was only maintained by those strong enough to defend it. 5 years had passed since the Vex Prime incident as it came to be known, and Lisa Grant stood on the observation deck of the newly commissioned Terran Defense Force ship called Horizon. This was the first vessel of humanity's third generation fleet, and around her floated representatives from 40 species who had come to witness the official launch. The ship was a joint venture, and it incorporated human innovations with contributions from a dozen allied species, and it represented everything the new galactic order was supposed to be. It represented cooperation and shared knowledge and mutual strength. Ambassador Helen Wright, who had come up from Earth for the ceremony, stood beside Lisa and commented that she heard this vessel included Valtorian shield technology. Lisa confirmed it and added that it also had Ceronian sensors and Kelvon engines and human weapon systems and artificial intelligence. She said it was not a human ship, but a galactic ship crewed by the best officers from 20 different worlds. Helen asked if Lisa thought it would work, because species that were shooting at each other a few years ago were now serving side by side. Lisa watched the crew moving through their stations with practiced efficiency, and humans worked alongside Valtorians and Ceronians, coordinated with Kelvons. Species that had been enemies were learning to be teammates. She said finally that it had to work because the alternative was going back to the old way, and none of them could afford that. The ceremony began, and Lisa delivered a speech she had been preparing for weeks. She talked about unity and diversity and about strength through cooperation and about building a future that honored the past while moving beyond it. But what she remembered most as the Horizon fired its engines and began its maiden voyage was the moment on Vex Prime, when 30 human warships emerged from nowhere and changed everything. The celebration had turned to quiet, and from that quiet humanity had found its voice in the galaxy. Years would pass and historians would mark that day as the moment the galactic order fundamentally changed. The old system of council dominance and enforced hierarchy gave way to something messier, but more dynamic. There would be conflicts, certainly, and there would be species that rejected the new order and tried to carve out their own empires. But there would also be cooperation on a scale never before seen. Human innovation combined with alien knowledge and created breakthroughs that benefited everyone. The galaxy became not a collection of dominators and dominated, but a community of species that, however imperfectly, worked together toward common goals. And at the center of it all was humanity, which was the species that refused to die, and that turned isolation into innovation, and that showed up uninvited to rewrite the rules of galactic civilization. Back on Earth in the Terran Defense Force headquarters, a young cadet named Danny Cooper studied the historical records of Operation Thunderclap. He read about Captain Lisa Grant and the 30 ships that held an entire star system hostage, and he read about the months of preparation and the years of secret development that made it possible. His instructor, Commander Claire Martin, stood behind him and watched as he absorbed the information. She asked what he thought the most important lesson was. Danny considered the question carefully and said he thought it was about never giving up even when everything seemed hopeless. Claire smiled and said that was part of it, but there was something more important. She explained that the real lesson was about knowing when to be patient and when to strike. She said humanity could have revealed their fleet earlier or attacked different targets, but they waited for the perfect moment when the Council was most vulnerable. Danny nodded slowly as understanding dawned, and he said timing was everything. Claire agreed and added that it was also about understanding your enemy better than they understood themselves. She explained that the Council thought they knew humanity, but they only saw what they wanted to see. Claire said they saw aggression and irrationality, but missed the creativity and determination and adaptability that made humans truly dangerous. She told Danny that in his career, he would face enemies who underestimated him, and the key was to use that underestimation as a weapon. On Vex Prime, which had become the capital of the new Galactic Assembly Chancellor, Vorath prepared for his final address before retirement. His term had been extended several times to provide stability during the transition, but now it was time for new leadership. He stood before the assembly and looked at the faces of delegates from over 60 species, and half of them had not even been part of the old council. Vorath began his speech by acknowledging his failures, and he said that history would remember him as the leader who nearly destroyed galactic civilization through arrogance and complacency. He said he accepted that judgment because it was accurate, but he continued that perhaps his greatest contribution was serving as an example of what not to do. Vorath explained that the old council believed their dominance was natural and permanent, but they learned the hard way that nothing is permanent. He said the new assembly was built on different principles, and it recognized that strength came from diversity and cooperation rather than domination. He urged the delegates to remember the lessons of the past and never become so comfortable that they stopped listening to new voices and new ideas. As Vorath finished his speech and stepped down from the podium, the assembly rose in respectful acknowledgement. He had made terrible mistakes, but he had also worked tirelessly to make amends, and that counted for something. Helen Wright, who now served as one of the senior ambassadors in the assembly, met with a group of younger diplomats from various species. They asked her what it was like in those early days when everything hung in the balance. Helen thought back to the moment when Lisa's face appeared on the holographic displays and the celebration turned to terrified silence. She told them it was the most frightening and exhilarating moment of her life because she knew that everything could go wrong. She explained that if the Council had decided to fight instead of negotiate, millions would have died and the galaxy would have been torn apart. But she said humanity had gambled that the Council valued survival more than pride, and that gamble paid off. One young diplomat asked if Helen thought the peace would last. Helen smiled and said that was up to all of them, because peace was not something that happened automatically. She explained it required constant work and constant vigilance and constant willingness to talk instead of fight. She told them that the galaxy would always have conflicts because different species had different needs and different values. But the question was whether they would resolve those conflicts through dialogue or through violence. Helen said the new assembly gave them the tools for dialogue, and it was their responsibility to use those tools. Far out on the frontier in a region that had once been contested territory, a mixed-crew human ship called the Pioneer explored an uncharted system. Captain Ryan Foster watched as his diverse crew worked together seamlessly and called out readings and coordinated maneuvers. His first officer was Valtorian, and his chief engineer was Ceronian, and his science officer was Kelvon, and his helm officer was human. They represented the new galaxy in miniature, and they were discovering things that no single species could have found alone. Ryan thought about how different things were now compared to just 5 years ago. Back then, this kind of cooperation would have been impossible, because the species represented on his bridge had been enemies. But the events at Vex Prime had shattered old assumptions and created space for new possibilities. He knew there were still challenges ahead, and there were still species that refused to join the assembly, and still regions where old hatreds ran deep. But for the first time in galactic history, there was a real framework for cooperation and a real commitment to treating all species as equals. The Pioneer continued its mission and pushed deeper into unexplored space and carried with it the hopes of a galaxy trying to build something better than what came before. Back on the bridge of the horizon, Lisa Grant watched the stars streak past as the ship completed its shakedown cruise. She thought about everything that had led to this moment, and about the desperate gamble that had paid off beyond anyone's wildest hopes. The celebration had turned to quiet, and from that quiet a new galaxy had been born. And that galaxy, for all its flaws and challenges, was a place where humanity finally had a voice and where cooperation was valued over domination. It was not perfect, but it was better, and sometimes better was enough. Lisa smiled as she looked at her mixed-species crew working together, and she knew that this was what they had fought for. Not conquest or revenge, but simply the chance to build something better alongside others who were willing to try. The galaxy would never be the same, and humanity would make sure of that.